sure I don't overrun. So, Wanakam, namaste everyone. I've been sent some questions in advance. I will read them off my sheet and then I will answer them. I seem to have some rather glaring headlights on my own spectacles, so I will be looking a bit off to the left, so excuse me if I don't make eye contact. Apparently it looks a bit better if I turn to the side. Question number 1 says, if Bhagavan says that the only freedom one has is either to identify as the doer of actions or turn inwards, then does that mean that we have no freedom from the thoughts that come to the mind, such as thoughts relating to family responsibilities, daily work, and so on? In other words, are all of our thoughts predetermined by the higher power? This is a really tough question. And I say it's tough because this is something that I always wondered about, and I never managed to find any satisfactory answer from Bhagavan himself. So we have instances such as Devaraja Mudalia saying, here I have a cup in front of me, or there's a fan. Is my decision to pick up this fan in this moment determined from the moment of my birth? And Bhagavan would always say yes. So he was quite insistent on an utterly deterministic script for everybody. But at the same time, he did say that moment to moment, each of us has the choice to not identify with the body which is performing its scripted actions. Now, to me, that seems to indicate that thoughts are not predetermined, because if they were, how could I say, right now I'm in the bathroom shaving, who is shaving the face? That seems to be an option that comes up moment to moment. And my understanding of Bhagavan's explanation of this is that we always have the freedom to go back to the I, which we think is performing our actions, to challenge the status of that I, and ultimately to make that I go back to its source, so we abide permanently in the I am not the doer state. There is one little quote. I'm always looking for wiggle room on this. I'm looking for a kind of get out of jail free card from Bhagavan, because along with a lot of other devotees, I find this rather rigid straitjacket of determinism a bit off-putting. That there is one line in Upadesha Manjari where Bhagavan says, destiny only affects the extroverted mind. Now, I quite like this because there's a possible implication of this that a corollary, the more you introvert your mind, the more you transcend your destiny. So that the mere act of looking at yourself, putting attention on the I, could in fact be possibly, I'm saying possibly because this is just an interpretation, be unrolling the script to some extent. You could though say it's, there's two ways of looking at this quote. You can take it in a binary way. The mind is extroverted, therefore it's subject to prarabdha, but when the mind dies, there's no prarabdha left. So there's no gradual movement back to the extinction of mind and the extinction of I am the doer. But I like to think that the corollary of the more you introvert your mind, the more you transcend your destiny is in fact a legitimate way of extrapolating that particular quote from Bhagavan. Because I have so little absolute data from Bhagavan on this, he never answered to my knowledge whether thoughts were predetermined. I want to put into the mix two stories from devotees of Bhagavan who, in my opinion, have some authority on this. Lakshmana Swami, I used to sit with him 30, 40 years ago, and he commented once, he said, I can't see the future. He was very good. He occasionally recognized people's past lives. And he said occasionally as he was walking down the street, he could see people who had no spiritual interest, no interest in realizing the self. He said, it just comes to you, it strikes you. That was his verb, it strikes you. It strikes you, you can see their future, you can even see their next birth. They're on a conveyor belt, they're on an assembly line, if you like. Nothing in their future is going to change because they haven't taken a decision to try and realize the self. They haven't come into the proximity of jnani. So he said, on some occasions, I look at people and I say, oh, next life, this, that, or the other. But he said, I look at you people in front of me here. And he said, it's like a fog. I never see anything. I never see any of your futures as you sit here before me. There's something about the proximity of jnana, according to him, and this is empirically based on what he saw and felt, that somehow put everybody's future in the mix. We're all in the melting pot. We all have this capacity to unravel our destiny by associating with jnana. The original verses that were read out at the beginning of this satsang, if you associate with sat, the pure sat, the inner sat, then you're in satsang. And I really believe that if you can find it internally in yourself, or externally if you're lucky through the grace of a living jnani, then there's something about that particular proximity to jnana, either internally or externally, that gets to work on your script in some way and somehow changes it, eliminates it, or at least makes it a little bit better. The other story is more of a parable, and it was told to me, or wasn't told, it was written out at great length by Papaji back in the 1990s. I asked him about Bhagavan's claim that karma can be mitigated in the presence of jnana, in the presence of a jnani. I said, for example, there's a theory that if you're destined to have a car crash, that's part of your script. Being in the proximity of a guru might mean that you end up just cutting your finger, and this homeopathic dose of your karma, in effect, is all you have to go through, because the grace of the guru has somehow mitigated it in a huge way. So Papaji said, why mitigate it? Why mitigate it? Why not get rid of it completely? This is the guru's job. It's the guru's job. The guru has so much authority, he can get rid of your karma completely. And then he told me this very long, complicated story, which he claimed was a Sufi story, which I've never heard or read anywhere else. And part of me is convinced he made it up just to make his point. But the story is about Moses, very unlikely character in a Sufi story, going on an annual pilgrimage to see God and have a chat with God. On the way there, he stays overnight at some poor person's house, and the woman says, oh, you're going off to see God, are you? We haven't had any children. Well, when you meet God, ask him to look in his book of destiny. He keeps a big book of destiny, and in that, everybody's future is in there. Just ask him to see if any children are destined to come our way. If they are, I'm fine. If they're not, I'm fine. I just need to know. I'd like to know what's written in this great book of destiny. Okay, says Moses. He goes off. He has his chat with God, and then he explains, I met this couple on the way here. They're childless. They're not asking for a baby. They just want to know what's written in your great book of destiny. So God says, okay, bring me the book. Let me have a look. The book is ceremoniously produced. They flick to the right page. He runs his finger down the column, and it says no children. So Moses says, thank you, sorry to put this on you. I'll go back and tell the couple. So he goes back, he tells the couple, and the woman is totally okay with this. So thanks, I just needed to know so I don't spend too much time thinking about this. Then Moses disappears, and before he comes back for his next annual pilgrimage, some saint comes by to this same villager's house. They serve him, they feed him, they look after him very well, and he blesses them. He just gives them a general blessing. And when Moses comes back the next year, there's a little baby in the household, and he thinks, oh, this is not right. Last year, I went to see God. God showed me the book. There's no children in this family's destiny. There's something wrong in God's record-keeping department. I better tell him that one of his record keepers isn't doing a very good job. So he went off to see God, and he said, by the way, that couple you told me about last year, I stayed with them again this year, and they had a baby, and don't really like complaining about your staff, but I think you should have a look and see what's going on. So God calls the record book again, runs his finger down the page, and again it says no children, but in the margin, there's a huge, like an elongated U. And God laughs and he said, "Ah, that explains it. This long, elongated U is a symbol for the tongue of the jnani, the tongue of the guru. There is a book of destiny, but there's a higher authority than that. The word or the presence or the blessing of a jnani, symbolized by this long, elongated U, has the capacity to eradicate or change anything that's in my book. That must be what's happened. Some great jnani must have come past." And in this story, the couple, they didn't ask for a baby. They simply sat in the presence of jnana. They gave hospitality to a passing jnani, and he was just pleased with them. So the happiness he got from being well served by these people was enough to change the destiny. So bottom line of this, there's two ways you can change your destiny. You can make the effort. You can look at the I moment to moment. You can say, who is doing this? Who is this I? You can challenge it. You can make it go back to your source. Or if it's if you're really, really lucky, the proximity of jnana, either in the external form of a guru or the internal form of your own self, can end your script, change your script, and remove your karma completely. That's question one. Next one, there were innumerable devotees of Bhagavan, but only a few got the realization, at least from the known records. It appears his drushti, the grace bestowed by his benevolent look, was essential to complete the process for many of his devotees. In the physical absence of Bhagavan, how does one get that grace? Another good question. Before I start answering it, I have a minor quibble. I don't think all of the devotees who are reporting to have realized the self got it necessarily with eye-to-eye contact. Bhagavan's mother, for example, I'm sure she got it through Bhagavan putting his hand on her heart in her final moments. Probably Lakshmi the cow got it the same way. Muruggana, he did say he got it through look. He wrote a verse saying that he was collecting leaves for a leaf plate with Bhagavan in Palakottu, and during the process, Bhagavan stopped and gave him this really, really piercing look, and that did it for him. There are others. You might say Tinai Swami got it through Bhagavan's word. Bhagavan just said one word, and that put him in the state. So not necessarily eye-to-eye contact, although there are cases like this. But when I give this short list of people who seem to have got it through Bhagavan's grace, you have to admit that proximity is involved in all of them. Whether you're touching a heart center, whether you're looking eye to eye, whether it's just general proximity or hearing a word by Tinai Swami, that there seems to be an essential component that you are within a few meters of Bhagavan in his presence. I would take slight issue with this in that we frame a perspective and a context for our exchange with the Guru. Because we imagine ourselves to be limited by our body, we are an internal observer looking at an external world. Bhagavan said that's not really what we are, but that's how we see ourselves, that's how we see the world. We construct a framework of externality and we populate it with figures who are like ourselves, one of whom we say, this one is enlightened, I will go into his proximity and hopefully he'll look at me or tell me some holy words and I'll realize the self. This is a kind of, it's as much a fiction as the dream world we create at night. Bhagavan gave a lovely analogy which he got from an old Tamil text, and he said the form of the Guru is like the form of a lion who appears in the dream of the elephant. The elephant is afraid of nothing except the lion. So the lion appears in the dream. The lion who symbolizes the Guru, he roars. The elephant wakes up, and then the elephant understands because he's now got the state. He's in the substratum of jnana. He realizes that the form of the lion in the dream was an unreal form. It came there, it roared, it woke him up. But then he realized that this whole time-space construct which he'd created wasn't real. The reality was the substratum that was underneath. When you wake up, you know the dream forms and the dream spaces are not real. So I think we tend to look at old texts on Bhagavan. We say, oh, this happened 80 years ago, 100 years ago. Bhagavan was sitting on his sofa. We take Bhagavan to be the body. We're missing out because we can't sit in front of that body anymore. We can't be looked at. He passed away 80 years ago. How can I get that same benefit that these people were benefiting? That's not what Bhagavan said. Bhagavan said that he is the self in the heart center of all, that because you have this external framework, this external positioning of yourself being an ignorant person in the presence of someone else who you believe has the capacity to extinguish your ignorance, then you somehow imagine that you need to be in that particular situation. How does one get that grace? This is the question everybody asks. Bhagavan insists grace is always available. You don't need to be in the physical presence of Jnani, because Bhagavan himself says, I am the self in the heart of all beings, as that was his favorite Gita verse. It's always available. If you're attracted to Bhagavan, you're experiencing this grace. If you're practicing his teachings, you're experiencing it. We opened this session with some quotes from Padamalai, and as I listened, I had no idea what they were going to be. As I listened to them, I said, well, that's actually answering some of the questions which are coming up today. But there's one which wasn't read out, and Bhagavan is saying, and it's being recorded by Maragana, people say, I'm not looking at them because they're looking in the wrong direction. We think that we have to sit on the floor in the old hall and look at a form on a sofa in order to get grace from that form to realize the self. Bhagavan said, no, that's wrong. You think I'm a body because you yourself think you're a body. And because of that, you come to the conclusion that the body in front of you is somehow in a better, superior state to you. It's got something that you haven't, and it's going to do something, some magic trick, some transmission across the space, across the interval of space between you, and to put you into the state that you think that form on the sofa is experiencing. What Bhagavan is saying is that I'm actually inside you, I'm on the inside, and I'm actually looking at you and smiling at you all the time. He said, if you're complaining that I'm not looking at you anymore, and I think that would probably be the complaint of everyone who didn't have the physical opportunity to sit with Bhagavan 1920s, 30s, 40s, Bhagavan is saying, I'm always available to you, not just as some abstract, formless self. He said, if you can turn your attention 180 degrees, go back to the inner self, you will see that seated in your heart, I am smiling at you all the time. So that's where you go to for that grace. If you're lucky, it's a bit of a free lunch. You can sit in the presence of a jnani and get it. But don't believe that you've missed out by not having had that opportunity to be with Bhagavan in person, because he says, that's not really me, that's not my real form. I don't have any form at all, that's just your imagination. Turn your attention within, turn your attention to that which you truly are inside yourself. And if you do that, then you'll see me looking at you, smiling at you. Next question. I believe Bhagavan taught the bliss of nirvikalpa samadhi is not to be indulged in because it consists of enjoying a trance-like state as a quasi-object. A person absorbed in this state does not clearly see what they actually are. I'm confused on this point because bliss, ananda, is also a genuine aspect of the self. Could you kindly shed some light on this teaching? Yes, it's true. Bhagavan didn't encourage people to pursue nirvikalpa samadhi. It is an intensely blissful state, according to Bhagavan and according to the yogis who strive for it. But Bhagavan said on several occasions it's a very, very subtle state of mind in which the mind has been suspended but not extinguished. It can be very blissful, it can be very long-lasting, according to Bhagavan, but it's a state where all of your vasanas, your desires are in a state of suspense. they're not being worked on, they're not being eradicated. And somehow in that state, you're not actually making spiritual progress. You're just enjoying a very, very pleasant experience. Bhagavan cited several scriptural stories of yogis who went into this state with one particular desire. The last desire, for example, there's a famous one about getting a drink of water for the teacher, and the sadhu goes into an incredibly deep, long experience that lasts almost his whole lifetime. And the moment he wakes up, the first thought that comes out is, I must get a glass of water for my guru. So this is a kind of suspended animation for the mind. It might be intensely blissful, but it's not a state that actually does you a lot of good, according to Bhagavan. I think the yogis might contest Bhagavan's statement that Nirvikalpa Samadhi is not the ultimate, but as a devotee, I'm going to take Bhagavan's word for this. S.S. Cohen once had on several occasions had good dialogues with Bhagavan about this, and he cited a previous conversation that he'd had with Bhagavan in which he said, you told me once that any state other than Sahaja Nirvikalpa Samadhi, Sahaja is the state when you're not introverted in a kind of internal bliss. Anything that isn't the Sahaja state in which you are aware of the self, you're aware that all appearances are manifestations of the self, you can function normally in the world without being cut off from it by your Nirvikalpa. He said any state that's different from prior to Sahaja is intellectual. Intellectual meaning that to some extent it's a subtle state of mind. Bhagavan agreed and said, yes, anything prior to Sahaja is mental, it's a mediated experience, it's not the full true experience of the self. So Bhagavan said what's needed is Sahaja Samadhi, and like many aspects of Bhagavan's teachings, he didn't see it as a hierarchy of graduated steps where you went through Kevala Samadhi, Nirvikalpa Samadhi, Sahaja Samadhi. He said aim for Sahaja straight from the beginning, that there's nothing to be gained by going through these other stages, which weren't part of his teaching syllabus, if you like. The terms come from other traditions. He was asked about them, and he said, go straight to Sahaja. Don't bother with these other states. You might get caught in endless bliss experiences. They might sound very nice, but long term, they're not going to liberate you. And as for the yogic state, which the yogis are very pleased with, Bhagavan conceded that Nirvikalpa Samadhi was something that you could experience when the Kundalini went to the Sahasrara. It would be an internal, incredibly blissful experience of the self. But Bhagavan said this is not liberation. He said if you adopt the schema of the Kundalini yogas and philosophers, he said there is a channel that goes to the Sahasrara, Kundalini goes up there, and when it arrives, you have this intense, blissful Nirvikalpa experience. But he said there's an extra channel. This is viewing things from the body, that the Sahasrara has to go down from the Kundalini has to go down from the Sahasrara through a channel and into the heart, and it has to die in the heart. Unless the I dies in the heart, then the full Sahaja, complete liberation experience is not going to be attained. So then he said, well, I will concede that you get the Nirvikalpa Samadhi if you can get your Kundalini up to the Sahasrara. He said it's a long-winded detour that doesn't result in liberation. The I has to go back to the heart, and he said the only way to do that is through inquiry or through complete self-surrender. Taking it through the Kundalini to the Sahasrara and back is complicated and possibly dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. And he said it's not necessary, it's a detour, and it may not even be good for you if you don't have a competent teacher. So just to explain a little definition, I should have done this at the beginning. In Nirvikalpa, you're not aware of differences. Nirvikalpa literally means no differences or no distinctions. When you experience Nirvikalpa, you're not aware of differences, but the mechanism that creates the differences has not been definitively ended. That's what happens when your eye goes to the heart and you have the full sahaja experience. What has disappeared is the mechanism through which differences might manifest. And from there on, you're permanently in the natural state and you can interact with the world. The original question said, Ananda is part of the self. Ananda is always described as a property, function of the self. I agree. In Nirvikalpa, you're getting, even though it may not feel like it, a mediated experience, whereas in the Sahaja state, it's natural. When Bhagavan was meditating in the temple in the 1890s and was completely oblivious to the world, he said that was Sahaja, it wasn't Nirvikalpa. And he said he was aware of what was going on around him, but he said the intensity of the bliss of the self was so compelling, so overwhelming, he just had no interest in putting his attention on anything that wasn't that bliss. So I think you can have a mediated bliss in Nirvikalpa Samadhi, but you're not aware of anything in your vicinity around you. Bhagavan's Sahaja bliss, if you like, the one he had in the temple in the 1890s, somehow the intensity of it was so strong, he had no capacity or interest in diverting his attention anywhere else. That's the difference. It was natural, it was inherent. And when the intensity wore off, naturally, spontaneously, Bhagavan didn't do anything. Then Bhagavan slowly reverted to what we would regard as a normal life and started interacting with the people around him. Next one. In a lot of my reading with the transcripts of Robert Adams, he emphasizes not reacting to thoughts and just observing. When I read his transcripts, I get a lot of peace. Two components to this question, which I won't conflate. I'll answer them separately. Looking at thoughts is something that you can do. It will slow down the mind. If you learn to witness your mind moment to moment, if you look at your thoughts, the thoughts won't run away with you. This is the basis of many meditation traditions. You observe a thought, you witness it, because you are focused on that thought in the moment, it doesn't run off and connect with another thought and the next and the next. There isn't a chain of daydreaming or fantasies that are going on, because the very act of looking tends to slow down the thoughts. So the original question is, or part of the original question was, how do I learn to stop reacting to external situations, to have some equanimity, to have some dispassion? This is one way of doing it, but it's not Bhagavan's way. Bhagavan wasn't a proponent or a fan of witnessing the mind. He, as far back as when he composed Nanyasa, Who Am I? He said there are two different categories of spiritual practice. There are those that look at objects, and he called those meditation, dhyana, and he said the other one is inquiry, and that looks at the subject. He said anything that puts attention on an object, whether it's your japa, an external image of a deity, witnessing your thoughts, there's an eye who looks at objects, contemplates them, keeps full attention on them. He said that's called meditation. He said it's good for purifying the mind, slowing the mind, being non-reactive to the world you live in. But he said ultimately it's not going to eliminate the mind. He said until the thinker, the witnesser of the thoughts, is tackled, dealt with, and eradicated, you're not going to be in that permanent state of sahaja that we spoke of before. So yes, witnessing your thoughts, according to Bhagavan, is a good process if you want equanimity. But he said ultimately it's better off to move on to inquiry, to hold on to the eye, to find out its source, watch it disappear, and then once it has disappeared, then you have no capacity to interact. Your latent interactiveness, if you like, has been banished forever, and you no longer have to make an effort moment to moment to not react to what's going on around you. Another part of the, how's it gone? Question 4. When I read his transcripts, I get a lot of peace. This is a different topic altogether. I spoke about this in the last Zoom talk I gave. I think that if you read words of truth, and those words of truth are saying, this is who you are, this is what you are. If you are in a quiet state, then you start to experience the truth of those words. They're not instructions, though an instruction, for example, would be look at your thought, witness your thoughts, don't let your mind run away with you, and then you'll be quiet and a little bit more peaceful. That's an instruction to do something. A lot of the words that you read in these holy books are simply people who've had the experience of the truth, telling you who you really are. And there's something about hearing those words, hearing them from someone who's had that experience for themselves, that puts you in that state very, very briefly. So I've had books, I think everyone who's read spiritual books has had some experience of this. You can't read it, you can't read them like a novel. You read 2 lines, you read a paragraph, and there's a kind of whoomph. There's a Shakti that comes off the page, and you can't read anymore. You're just put in a state of silence, peace, happiness. You put the book down, and you enjoy the silence and the peace. That is, to me, making the best use of the words, because you're accessing the power in those words. You're not taking delivery of those words, making a theory inside your head. You're not arguing with them. You're not disputing them. You're not using them to formulate a plan of action, what you should do next. You're listening to the words of truth, and you're feeling the peace that comes off the person who uttered those words of truth. I would like to understand Bhagavan's teachings on worldly action due to mind and body, and how this can be minimized to spend more time on focusing inwards. I think everyone who's a devotee of Bhagavan, everyone who's read the books, will have read stories of people coming to Bhagavan saying, I want to give up my job, I want to be a sannyas, I want to stop being a family person. And I have yet to find a single example of anybody in the entire Bhagavan literature to whom Bhagavan said, yes, good idea. Bhagavan never advised giving up any responsibilities or duties or obligations that you had in the world. We started off this satsang talking about the scripted destiny that we all have. In most of our destinies, we end up with stuff to do. We have partners, we have jobs, we have commitments, we have parents, we have children. Bhagavan didn't say that giving these up was a move in the right direction. He said you can run off to a cave, you can run off to an ashram, but the one thing you can't leave behind is your mind. Wherever you go, your mind is still inside your head, and wherever you sit down and say, now I've got time to do my spiritual practice, the same mind that was bothering you in the house or in the job is going to carry on bothering you at your new destination. So Bhagavan said that's not the solution. That the solution is to be aware of what the mind is doing moment to moment. In your spare time, in the time you have that you don't have duties and obligations, try to make it go back to its source. And ideally, if you're in the world, then as you do your daily actions, as you look after your family, do your job, try to remember what Bhagavan has said, that you are the self, that you're not the person performing the acts. Just moment to moment, see what the mind is doing. Don't let it convince you that you're a person in a body who has to do things. Don't waste your spare time. Siva Prakasam Pillai, I like this. He was the ultimate exemplar of a desperate, busy family man. I think he had lots and lots of daughters and no job, and he was facing the prospect of marrying off all his daughters. He came to Bhagavan in a bit of a panic and asked what he should do. And Bhagavan said, you have some free time. You have a little bit of free time. In your free time, go back to the self. Put some intensive effort into your sadhana during the free time that you have, And then when you go back to the world, when you go back to looking for your job, looking after your family, the silence, the peace that you've created for yourself, inside yourself, through your practice, it's like you've put some money in the bank, you've got some credit in your silence account, and when you go back into the world, you can spend your silence. You can walk into the family arguments, the office arguments, with a quiet, peaceful frame of mind, and it percolates off into all the things that you're doing. So what he isn't saying is give up activities of the body. He's not saying give up your job, give up your family. What he's saying is give up this idea that you are a person in the body who has to do things, and that by running away to a different place, you're somehow going to make it a lot easier to do your jobs and find the self. Here's something political for a change. Seeing what is going on in the US, I'm reminded of Bhagavan's answer to a question put forward by a devotee. What is it that I can do in this world to make a better world around us? Bhagavan's answer to that devotee was to understand himself. If you do that, it will be the best help you can render to the world. And he says, I quote this from memory. Well, the memory is reasonably accurate. That's something that Bhagavan often said. He said once that a jnani meditating in a cave in the Himalayas, whose jnana is unknown to anybody else except himself, is doing more good for the world than all the social activists, the social reformers in the world. He did not believe in spending one's time trying to make the world a better place. One of his little maxims was, it's God's job Ishwara's job to run the world. It's not our job. We shouldn't be attempting to take over Ishwara's job, do his job for him. He said there are two different obligations here. God's job is to run the world. Our job is to become one with God, to find the source of God inside ourselves and to abide there. That's very nice. It's very theoretical. Doesn't necessarily help us with our day-to-day living. But whenever a question like this comes up, it's always useful to look at Bhagavan himself. How did Bhagavan deal with what was going on around him? To what extent did he intercede, help, become an activist, if you like? So I think we've all read the books. We all know that Bhagavan was extremely helpful, compassionate. He looked after the animals in his vicinity. He even appointed himself watchman of the trees in the ashram to make sure they weren't harmed too much. If people had problems, they were free to come to him. There was something about him that his switch, if you liked, was always in helpful mode. He was always willing to do the right thing by the people who came to him, but he didn't tour around the world preaching. He didn't go out and encourage people to change the world or make it a different place. He kept his interaction with the problems of the world local. If there was anything in his vicinity that came to his attention, he would say something, do something, solve some problem in his immediate vicinity, and then move on to the next thing. So I would take this to be good advice for everybody else. Live your life. Don't close your eyes and say, suffering is not real, it's all imaginary, I'm not going to do something. If you see someone injured by the side of the road, it's your job to go over there, maybe call 911, do something about it. But don't turn your helpfulness, don't turn your desire to alleviate suffering into a professional campaign. Don't run around the world saying, I can fix this. This is God's job. We mentioned Robert Adams. I read out a question. He had this wonderful little saying, all is well. Whenever people talked about the stories of the world, he would just say, all is well. That this is the perspective of someone who knows himself to be self. If you're in that state, if you know yourself to be self, then the idea there's something wrong with the world and I have to fix it is itself wrong, it's false, it's ignorance. There's an unfolding of the things that are destined to happen. They're supervised, put into motion by Ishvara. If things in our vicinity are bothering us, then we can attend to them. But it's not our job to go out of our way, join a mass movement, and dissipate all our energy in trying to do Ishvara's job and make the world a better place from our perspective. Bhagavan, I mentioned earlier on, Bhagavan's favorite Gita verse from chapter 10. He said, I am the self, O Gudaseka, in the heart of all beings. I am the beginning, the middle, and likewise the end of all that exists. If you are a jnani, that's your position, that's your perspective. You abide in jnana as jnana. You know that everything that goes on in the world is unfolding as it should. You have no sankalpa, you have nothing in you says this is wrong, this shouldn't be like this, I must change this. Something inside you knows everything is good, everything is correct, everything is as it should be, self is unfolding. It's not my business to do anything except to abide as that self. Then early this morning when I turned on my computer, it's morning here in Perth, a late question came in. I'll just check my email, and it says, during this past year, it's connected to this question, so I'm adding it here. During this past year, I have found solace in thinking of what Bhagavan would do in any particular circumstance. I think I just answered that one. Bhagavan would see what was going on around him. He would make suggestions. If people didn't listen to his suggestions, he'd just keep quiet. He wasn't going to keep saying the same thing again and again. If nobody listened to him, he just sat quietly. I think Bhagavan would say, just keep quiet. The world isn't your business. People would come from the independence movement and try to get him to endorse large-scale political action, acts of civil disobedience. And his general response was, Gandhi is not attached to the fruits or consequences of anything he does. If you try to do something because you think there's something wrong with the world, that you have a goal that you think will make the world a better place, then you have the wrong attitude. He said Gandhi doesn't have that attitude. He does his work without expectations of a consequence, and he does his work without expecting any particular outcome. So that this was what Bhagavan repeatedly said to the freedom fighters, the independence workers who came, that the goal itself is the problem. Don't set yourself goals, because then you get enmeshed in the I am the doer idea, and then you're on the treadmill of having to do more and more to change a world which ultimately has its own script, and you're just going to be banging your head on a wall trying to change it. The next bit of the question says, we have experienced social and political unrest, economic uncertainty, and a pandemic. I tell myself that Bhagavan sat out 2 world wars and the Great Depression without the need to alter the course of his life. But today I just realized I don't really know what Bhagavan did during those periods. Let's take the high ground on this. I will say that Bhagavan did absolutely nothing at all. When you know yourself to be the self, you have definitively, permanently extinguished the I am the doer idea. I think you could say quite correctly, Bhagavan did absolutely nothing during the Great Depression, World War I, World War II, simply because the doer in him didn't exist. There was nothing in him to make a response to these events. He knew himself to be the self. He watched events unfold from the perspective of the self and never had the slightest interest in outcomes, wanting to change, because he knew somehow everything was being taken care of. I see that you read the newspaper actively. What can you tell us about how Bhagavan dealt with the worldwide calamities? We're back on this same question. What was his advice to devotees during the 2 world wars and the Great Depression? I think his advice was the same, and it wasn't related to world wars or Great Depressions. He would tell people that you are suffering because you have a wrong perspective. You think you're a person who lives in the body. Because you think you're a person who lives in the body, then you also think you have choices, and that as an extension of that, you think you have to choose the right course of action. You think there's a war on, should I volunteer and fight? Should I protest against it? These are all outgrowths of the same basic wrong idea that you're a person who lives in a body, who has choices to make and decisions to make. Bhagavan said that's all completely wrong, that there's nobody there. The idea that you have to do something is your ignorance, your wrong idea, and it's the source of all your suffering. And that once you get rid of this I am the body idea, this notion, it's only a notion that there's an individual self in the body, then everything will go well. Actions will continue, but they'll all be powered, motivated, and concluded by the self. You won't be included. You're not in the loop anymore. You're out of it. I'll say one thing. So somebody once asked Bhagavan if he felt compassion for all the suffering people around him, and he surprised everybody by saying, no, if you feel compassion, then you see differences. You think, I have something better that these people don't have. I have something good that I can give them to eradicate their suffering or improve their worldly condition. He said the true jnani isn't aware of anything other than himself, and because of that, he doesn't distinguish between his own state and apparent suffering states of other people, feel compassion for them and reach out and do something about them. If you're in that state, you don't think or feel there's an external world out there which is defective in some way. There are people suffering in it. I must help them. That's not jnana drishti. That's not the perspective of jnana. The perspective of jnana is that jnana alone exists, and that within perspective of jnana, everything is happening as it should, and there's no need to do anything about it. So that's the end of my questions. I have some spare time. I'm open to any others.
Anybody who wants to ask a question, can you unmute yourself and then you can ask the question?
Rama, I have a question.
Go ahead.
David, have you made any progress on the book on Morris Friedman?
I have, serendipitously, as these things tend to happen. A few weeks ago, I was contacted by a Polish pilot who was a devotee who was running around collecting information on Friedman. He was in Poland, and he's volunteered his assistance as a translator. His English is excellent. He is contacting many people in Poland who knew Morris. He's willing to translate. We have a lot of correspondence from Morris between us. He's going to go through it all, translate bits which look interesting to me. I got inspired by this to go back to my notes, which were gathering dust. I've started work. I don't know when there will be an end product, but yes, I've gone back to it. The project has a bit more energy, and I hope to move it along later this year.
Oh, great. Looking forward to it.
Anybody else who has a question?
This is Ashok. I have a question.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, can you speak up a little bit?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, better. Yes.
Okay, the question is there a way to strike a balance between discovering your inner self and also trying to make a difference in the world?
I think we've covered this a little bit. Bhagavan couldn't, how should we say, he told people off for sitting with their eyes closed, meditating. If there were jobs that needed to be done, if there were people experiencing some small forms of suffering, he himself would take the initiative. He would look after people around him. But as I said, the balance for him seems to be, don't make a career out of it. Don't decide that you've been appointed or it's your job or it's your responsibility to run around fixing things. He said, insofar as you have any obligation at all, your obligation is to try to find out who you are and to abide there. There's a lovely little phrase, I think he told Swami Abhishektananda. He said, your duty is to be, it's not to be this or that. Your duty is to be. So if you're talking about duties or obligations, your primary one is being, it's not doing. Your primary obligation is to find out your own inner sense of being, to dwell in that inner sense of being, but not to be completely oblivious to things that might not be going well around you. If you see little things that you can fix, then by all means do it, but don't get obsessed over them.
Thank you.
I have a question. May I ask?
Go ahead.
So in Mr. Godman, in your book, it's you said that Bhagavan said, the self is always present, always experienced. And then he adds, one can become aware of the self if once the self-limiting tendencies of the mind cease. So the question, actually, this is from my father, is he's saying how to make the self-limiting tendencies of the mind cease.
The idea that you are a person inside a body is the self-limiting tendency. Bhagavan has two famous solutions to this. Either you inquire what is the nature of this I who thinks it's self-limited to the body. Put attention on the I which thinks your thoughts, perceives your perceptions, feels your feelings. He said it's a false entity. It's something that appears to exist there, which lives its life causing trouble for you because it's not challenged, it's not looked at properly, it's not identified as monster, which it truly is. Bhagavan said, hold on to this sense of I, don't let it run off by I must do this, I am this person who must achieve that. He said all of these things which are predicates of the I, they're what somehow externalize you, make you suffer. The self-limitation brings thoughts into your consciousness. You think you have to deal with them, and that's what causes your problems. What Bhagavan is saying is this notion, this central conceit, that there is something inside you which organizes your life, which has to be cultivated, worshipped almost as the God inside your body. He said that's wrong. He said just look at it, it's just causing you problem. Look at this thing called I, which you claim to be who you really are. Look at it, disassociate it from all the things it's trying to entertain you with, disassociate yourself from its wrong views, its wrong perspectives. And when it's not reaching out to connect with any other bad idea, it can't exist by itself in isolation. It slowly sinks back into its source and it disappears. And that's when your self-limitation ends, because you find out the true I rather than the false limited I, which has been your perspective up till that moment. So he said, either you do that by inquiry or you surrender it to whatever divine power you think is the most effective in your case. He said, those are the two direct paths and those are the two that work.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask a question.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much. A Buddhist teacher and psychotherapist, John Welwood, defined spiritual bypassing as the tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. David, in your experience as a devotee and in applying Bhagwan's teachings, how can we as devotees avoid spiritual bypass?
That's an interesting question. I think anytime you think that you've got something of value for the world, anytime you think this is how the world should be, this is how it can be improved, catch yourself doing it. This isn't your business, this isn't your responsibility, and ultimately the I, which has jumped up and said, I have a job, I have a role, I have a responsibility, that's the thing that's causing these problems. The idea that you have things to accomplish, things that must be done, it all goes back to this sense of something in the body has said, I live here. Once it's done that, it sets an agenda for itself. It says, oh, I see problems, I see things outside myself which need fixing. What Bhagavan is saying is, no, don't go that route. You're just reinforcing this wrong notion of an individual self. He said, challenge its very basis, challenge its existence, look at it. Don't let it run off with ideas of what it should or shouldn't do. Don't let it indulge in false feelings, false identities. Catch hold of it. When you see it jumping off to associate or identify with something else, catch it and say, no, I'm not going there today. That's not my business. That's not my responsibility. And just go back to this raw, unassociated feeling of I. And he says, if you do that, you'll find that your tendency to think that you can fix things, solve things, improve things, change things, they will all wither away, because they're all an outgrowth, they're all contingent on this idea that you have about yourself, that you live in a body. He said it's much, much better to get rid of this I that wants to do things than make an agenda of things that should be done, which ought to be done. He said your perspective is wrong. While you have this imaginary idea of an I inside a body, then you have imaginary ideas of a world outside, and you use more imagination to set up a script for yourself in the world to decide how the world should be run, how the world should be a better place. He said that's just a waste of your mental energy, and it's akin to being in a dream world where you see hunger, suffering, and you spend all of your time running around serving out pots of food to the hungry dream figures. He said, just wake up. That's all you need to do. Just wake up and realize that the idea of a person who lives in your body is the source of all your problems, all your wrong decisions. And when that goes, there are no more decisions to make.
Thank you.
Rama, can I ask a question?
Go ahead, please.
Hi, good evening. David, thank you so much for the wonderful answers. I had a question about Bhagavan's words on progress towards jnana. For example, he has said the degree of absence of unwanted thoughts is one of the markers for progress. He also mentioned something about the aham sphurana. Could you comment a little bit about that? In terms of what Bhagavan has said about that particular aspect?
Bhagavan, excuse me, I'm not used to talking so much. Bhagavan did say that you can gauge your progress to the extent that you are free from unwanted thoughts. To that extent, you can say progress is being made. But it's very, very hard if you're on the inside of a mind to really evaluate how pure you are, how close your mind is to extinction. I would say it's virtually impossible. All you can do is stick with your practice, stick with your surrender, stick with your inquiry. I would say that self-evaluation is using an invalid instrument to the mind to work out when this invalid imaginary instrument might cease to be an invalid instrument. It's not really a productive endeavor. As for the aham sphurana, Bhagavan, for those who don't know, this is a kind of strong, almost pulsating feeling of I, which Bhagavan said occasionally was the precursor of a full experience of the self. I will say, if you're having the true aham sparana, very good, you are making progress, but that's not a necessary route through which the self is realized. Bhagavan himself mentioned this to, what was his name, Swami Siddheswarananda, who was with the Ramakrishna mission. He said that on the day of his own realization, as the I was going back to its source, this aham sparana, which I would equate with the I, became very clearly known and experienced, and then the aham sparana subsided in the self and disappeared. Bhagavan mentioned this in Ramana Leela, which is the Telugu biography by Krishna Bhikshu. It doesn't appear in the standard account in Self-Realization, but I think Krishna Bhikshu elicited this extra information in a later edition of Ramana Leela. So Bhagavan spoke about how on the day of his realization, as the I was on its way back to its final extinction in the self, this aham sparana feeling manifested in him. He did say it was something that could happen at any time. There are some people who say it's a precursor of a full experience of the self, and that it shows you're almost there, almost enlightened. I find nothing in Bhagavan's words or writings that indicate it's the penultimate stage of sadhana, and after that you go into the self, stay there and never come out. He did say you could experience aham sparana even through fright. So I don't necessarily think it's a reliable signpost on the way to being almost enlightened, but if you're having it very, very good, it's a very good experience.
Thank you so much for sharing that, David.
Vijay Rajamani?
Can I ask a question here?
Please, just go ahead.
As I understand, we should view the results as just happenings and not as a result of our actions. Does it mean that we should neither feel responsible for the goals nor the actions associated with these goals?
If you think I am the doer, if you embark upon a course of action, then you are responsible for what comes next. You can't evade responsibility by saying, oh, it's all the self, not my business, there's no individual self, I'm not taking responsibility for this. If you have an individual self, then there's a mechanism that causes you to choose and decide what that individual self is going to do next. And depending on your action and the motives behind it, those actions will accumulate some karma, and somewhere down the line, you have to experience the fruits of that. This is inevitable. If you have an I, you make choices, you make decisions, you make actions, all predicated on this I am the doer, I am the desire idea. You can't disown the consequences. There are only no consequences when I itself has been definitively extinguished.
Thank you.
I have a kind of simple question. You've been talking about the I thought and between the self and the mind. Is it the same as the ego? I mean, because I hear about the ego a lot in other areas, and is the I thought synonymous with that?
Bhagavan wasn't a nitpicky philosopher. He tended to conflate items together and bundle them. He would say, I thought is the mind, I thought is ego. Everything that's not the self, if you want a classification, is mind, it's ego. He said specifically the I thought is that wrong assumption inside yourself that somebody lives inside your body who has to choose and decide what to do next. I think if you want a dividing line between what's the state of the jnani and what's the state of the ajnani, the jnani never thinks there is an entity inside myself that has to choose and decide what to do next. There is no individual I that has any desires, that has any choices, that feels compelled to do anything. The power of the self will make him say the things he says, make him do the things he does, but there won't be an individual chooser in there who says, this is my plan, this is what I'm going to do next. So the I thought that we have is simply a wrong assumption, a wrong identity, so that when, right now I'm looking at my TV screen, I say, I see myself in a little box on a T screen, on a computer screen. Bhagavan would say that's a wrong perspective, a wrong framing. There isn't an internal I who looks outside and sees an external image. He said this dichotomy between having an internal I and an external world which is observed, thought, acted upon, is the source of your problem. And he says it arises because you have allowed an unreal entity inside yourself, which you generally call I, to take charge of your life, to make your decisions for you, to choose and decide what to do next. I think, I feel, I want, I decide, I choose. He said that I is common to all those mental propositions, those mental activities. And he said by inventing this I, then you have to immediately invent an agenda for it. You engage in thoughts, you engage in actions, and having done that, you have to reap the consequences of those thoughts and actions. He said, when there's nothing inside you that says, I see something different from me, I am feeling this thought, he said, that's the true self, the true I, that's who you are. And at that point, there are no plans. Everything unfolds as it should.
Thank you. Back to something practical. To deal with that, you can either surrender or you can practice self-inquiry, is what I've heard said. Can we just do both?
Of course, they're not exclusion. The classic analogy you hear from all the teachers, it's like two wings of a bird. One is bhakti, one is jnana. And they often say you don't really make any progress as a bird if you've only got one wing. It's much better to have two if you want to fly fast in a straight line. So there's no restriction that you have to pick one or the other. I think most devotees have an affinity with one or the other, but that doesn't mean that they have to do it to the exclusion of the other. That they can both be done well, done properly, in harness. They make for better progress than doing them one at a time.
Thank you.
So I have a question, David, sort of following up to, I think, your previous answer, which is, that means that this concept of free will is really also just a fabrication of the small I. Is that correct?
Bhagavan used to say that free will and determination are ideas that can only exist in conjunction with each other so long as there is the existence of an individual I. He said, in the self, there's neither free will nor predestination. So that there's a kind of domain in which we think there's a dichotomy between free will and predetermination, but that's our self-created world. He said, once you know yourself to be self, then there is no destiny, there is no free will, neither terms has any applicability there.
Thank you.
Namaskar, David.
Namaskar.
So one of the challenges or impediments any spiritual seeker faces in any path is the rising of the spiritual ego. I mean, there's the ego and then there's the spiritual ego. Any practical pointers on how one can recognize that within themselves and correct it?
This is very difficult because we all want self-affirmation. We get up in the morning, we sit cross-legged, we have a meditation. It appears to go very well. We were quiet, we were peaceful, we had no, well, let's say less disturbing thoughts than usual. And so we evaluate, we say, oh, that was a good meditation, because we're comparing it to yesterday's or last week's. That's in a sense spiritual ego, but it shouldn't stop you from trying to do it the next morning and the next. Don't just assume that any evaluation that you have on how good you are, how well you're practicing, how close you are to getting permanent results, just say to yourself, I don't have the correct perspective on this. I have no idea. I have no capacity to determine it. It may look like I've just had a good experience. Fine, enjoy your silence, enjoy your peace while it's there, but don't necessarily think, I'm better than that person next to me. He got up and went out for a walk halfway through our meditation. Just look after your own business. Don't worry about how well or how badly you're doing. All you can do is every time that you find that your mind is somewhere where it shouldn't, notice it and take it back to the I or surrender it. It's an incredibly simple system with Bhagavan. You're not asked to evaluate yourself at all. In Who Am I? Bhagavan actually says, don't waste your time or suffer because you think I'm not a good person, I'm a great sinner. Likewise, he would say, don't think I'm a great person because I've gone into samadhi for 10 years. That's what we spoke about when I talked about the yogis in Nirvikalpa Samadhi. According to Bhagavan, they're not making any progress either. They're just in a state of rather blissful, suspended animation. The point is, whether you've just spent years as a yogi in samadhi or whether you've just had a good morning sit, the I is still there, and it's the I's tendency to say, oh, I did rather well today, or that was no good. Don't put labels on yourself, how well you're doing, how badly you're doing. This is just another trick of the mind to keep your attention off the place where it should be. Keep it on the I, or give the I up, but don't bask in the glow of how well you're doing, and don't beat yourself up because you think you're doing badly.